Hello, Global Fact. Welcome to the keynote panel of the academic track at Global Fact 7, Lessons of the Infodemic. This is the first time that we've had an academic track at Global Fact. And of course, we were meant to be gathered at Oslo Met University in Oslo. But I think this just means that we'll have an even bigger audience of researchers and fact checkers and journalists and others who are interested in research about fact checking. I just wanted to note that there's a remarkable history of collaboration between fact checkers and academic researchers. So I think that the academic track will be part of the agenda from now on, starting next summer when we're back in Oslo for Global Fact 8. So this morning, we've got an excellent panel to talk about lessons of the infodemic. We're going to talk about really two things. One is what academic research tells us about the flow of misinformation around COVID-19, about where it comes from, what effects it has, how to fight it. And we'll also talk a bit about what lessons the infodemic has for us in terms of setting new priorities or highlighting gaps in academic research. So I'll introduce our panel now, who should be coming up on the screen. We've got Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, Dr. Nielsen of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, Dr. Theresa Amobi of the University of Lagos, Dr. Elizabeth Saad of the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and Dr. Thorsten Quandt of the University of Münster. We're having some technical difficulties bringing in Dr. Amobi, so hopefully she'll be able to join us a bit later in the discussion. We're going to start with a keynote presentation by Rasmus to set the stage for our conversation. Then we'll give the other panelists a chance to introduce themselves and give their own opening thoughts about how we should be thinking about what the WHO called the infodemic of misinformation around COVID-19. So without wasting any more time, I'll turn it over to Rasmus, whose team at the Reuters Institute has been doing really remarkable work. They've really leapt into the fray to understand what people know about COVID-19, where they've been getting misinformation, what information and misinformation. Rasmus, thanks so much for starting us off.
Thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this conversation today. I have tremendous respect for the work that fact checkers do around the world, and also hope that researchers can perhaps help them do their really important work. So really, I want to start with this premise, if you will, that the coronavirus pandemic is a communication crisis in addition to being a medical emergency. Each of us face the risk and uncertainty that comes with a new and still poorly understood disease. Each of us face the risk and uncertainty that comes with interpreting and responding to how our governments and other powerful institutions respond to it. And each of us face the risk and uncertainty that comes with the question of what each of us will do to protect ourselves, to protect our loved ones, and to protect our communities. We cannot and we must not deal with all that risk and uncertainty only on the basis of our own personal experience and what we think that we know. We have to rely on others. Perhaps on public health experts, perhaps on politicians, on public authorities, on platform companies, and publishers, all of whom may help us understand the pandemic, help us judge our government's responses, and help inform how we respond ourselves. There's great power in this. Collectively, we know more about the pandemic than any one of us do on our own, and it's also only collectively we'll be capable of minimizing its death toll and handle the wider economic, political, and social impact. None of us can do this alone. There's also a great vulnerability in this. Every time we trust someone else, we take a risk. What if they're not to be trusted? What if they meant well but got it wrong? What if their motives were mixed and the results uneven? What if we misunderstood them? What if they were making shit up or deliberately trying to mislead us? And here, I think, we arrive at the coronavirus communications crisis. Much of the news and information we are presented with about the pandemic is at best imperfect. Often it's ambiguous, and some of it is misleading or outright false. There's a lot of it, and there is an eager appetite for some of it as people try to understand and respond to the situation and often dive into information vacuums where no reliable or credible information exists. And this, of course, is the situation that the WHO has described as an infodemic, a kind of tsunami of misinformation rumors, but also of information. So how do people navigate this infodemic? Who do they rely on to guide them through the communications crisis that's accompanying the pandemic? How well is that working out in terms of how much people know about the disease? And what sources and platforms are they most concerned about as possible conduits for potentially false or misleading information? These are big and important, urgent questions. And as a scientist, maybe I should just answer, we don't know, to all of them. Wrap it up here by saying more research is needed and return to my desk. That would be true. We don't know. It would be safe. I could just get some writing done. I also think it would be a dereliction of duty. If scientists are not willing to put themselves on the line and do their honest best of trying to make sense of big, important, urgent questions, how can we expect journalists, policymakers, or the public to rely at least in part on our work as they address them? How can we expect them to see the value of scientific work? Give me 2 years and I'll let you know is not a good answer in a global crisis. Science has its own imperfections. Scientists have their own selfish motivations, and rushed and sloppy work may be more dangerous here than in any other line of work. But I would suggest that every one solid evidence-based study we can bring to bear on our problems now is worth dozens of more sophisticated studies coming out years later in fancy journals. And I'm really proud to see how many different researchers from around the world have stepped up to try to address this crisis and worked with journalists and fact checkers and the World Health Organization and many others. I'll just share a few empirical insights specifically from our work here at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism to illustrate the ways in which we have tried to step up and make some contributions to this discussion. Like all research science, this is uncertain and it's subject to revision as we collect more data and as the situation evolves. And the findings will not necessarily apply in every country or every context. We still hope it's useful in understanding how people around the world are navigating the infodemic. The underlying premises of our work in this area are the following. First, that we need to understand information and misinformation together in the wider context of media and information use, with constant attention to how political beliefs and social identities influence how people engage with and use information. Second, while it's important to identify misinformation and different types, sources, and claims of misinformation and the sources and platforms that spread misinformation, we should be at least equally attentive to outcomes, whether people are in fact misinformed. Third, all information and misinformation is also relational. They're social facts that transcend their truth value and the meaning of each of us for us as individuals. And beyond the cases where professional fact checkers or others can determine the veracity of individual claims, and even beyond the much, much wider universe of often highly consequential and political expression that actually makes no specific statements of fact at all. Problems of misinformation are at least in part about how people think of misinformation, what they think it is, and where they fear that it comes from. If, for example, people think that independent news media and professional journalists produce quote-unquote fake news, they probably won't read it, they probably won't trust it, and they probably won't engage with it. So where are we with the work that we have done at the Reuters Institute? First, and perhaps most fundamentally, what are the sources that our work suggests that people rely on for news and information on the coronavirus? When we surveyed nationally representative samples of internet users across 6 countries in early April, countries with a combined population of about 600 million, the findings in one sense were clear but also complex. They were clear in that news organizations are clearly very central. Across the 6 countries we cover, they were often the most widely relied upon sources of news and information, and on average about 2/3 say they've relied on news organizations, ranging from a low 47% in Germany to a high 77% in South Korea. I think the results were also complex in that news organizations are far from alone. Not only do we find that between half and a quarter of our respondents say that they have not used news as a source of information about the coronavirus in the past week, we also find that there are many other sources that people widely name as things they rely on, especially governments, health authorities, and scientists, which presumably are often accessed via news media or perhaps online, but are still widely seen as sources of news and information about the crisis. And of course, many say that they rely on platforms, including search engines, social media, video sharing sites, and messaging apps to access news and information about the coronavirus, just as they rely on these platforms for so much else. Now, people don't trust all of these sources and platforms equally. In our work, we've documented a very significant trust gap between the relatively high levels of trust in news media, at least in April, specifically around the issue of the coronavirus, and then much lower levels of trust in search, and especially in social media, video sharing sites, and messaging applications, where there's a very, very large trust gap between news organizations and these platforms. It's also clear that the early sort of rally around the flag effect we saw in many countries doesn't always last. At least in the UK, where we have surveyed every 2 weeks for much of the crisis, the initial upsurge in trust in established institutions have been followed by a non-stop decline in trust in news media, but especially in government, just as news avoidance has increased as fatigue sets in. But still, even with declining trust and even with increasing news avoidance, these are the sources and platforms that people rely on, news organizations, but also governments, and often accessed via large platforms that people may have some reservations about. Now, second, I think the question then is, what significant associations can we find between using these different sources and platforms for information, and how much people actually know about the coronavirus as a disease? As I said from the outset, there is great power in relying on others, but they can make us more knowledgeable, more capable. But there's also a great vulnerability. If we trust those who are not trustworthy, it might leave us misinformed. And of course, we have plenty of reason to worry about this, as everyone involved in this conference knows well. Some individual politicians have demonstrably lied and misled the public about the coronavirus and their response. Some governments even try to deny that this disease even exists in their communities. News media that are now under heightened scrutiny for their often poor record of covering police violence and racism also sometimes get the facts wrong. And of course, we have copious evidence of the widespread problems of false and misleading information shared, spread, and sometimes amplified via various platforms. To try to understand how these very real misinformation problems influence how informed people are, in our survey research, we've asked people a series of factual questions about the coronavirus. Most of these questions are drawn from the World Health Organization's own official coronavirus Mythbuster site. For each statement, we ask respondents whether it's true, whether it's false, and also give them an option to answer that they don't know. And in this way, the number of correct answers that people give to these factual questions provide, I think, a narrow, but still hopefully a useful indication of how much they actually know about the coronavirus as a disease. I think the most important takeaway here from our research is that most people do relatively well. A clear majority answers most of the questions we pose to them correctly, and many of those who do not answer correctly simply say that they don't know. Perhaps most people are, in fact, relatively informed and resilient enough to be exposed to at least some misinformation from politicians and via platforms and still not be misinformed. We find that social factors like education matter, with slightly lower levels of knowledge amongst those with limited formal education. We find that political factors matter too, with those sympathetic to politicians who have advanced false and misleading claims about the coronavirus, often less informed in many countries. And when we control for these social and political factors, as well as democratic factors like age and gender, we have two further findings I think is worth highlighting. The first is that in most of the countries we've studied, we find a clear, positive, and significant association between relying on news organizations as a source of information about coronavirus and knowing more about the disease. It may sound like I'm preaching to the choir when I tell you that news help make people more informed, but I am just reporting an empirical finding here. The second finding I want to highlight is that we find no similar, consistent, significant associations, neither positive nor negative, between relying on platforms and how informed people are. In a few countries, there are negative associations for some specific types of platforms, specifically video sharing sites and messaging applications. And in a few countries, we find a small, significant association for search. Social media, we find no positive or negative association in any of the 6 countries covered in our research. Finally then, in addition to relying on publishers, politicians, and platforms for news, and in addition to the fact that we find that people are more informed when they rely on news, how does the public think about the problems of misinformation and information around a crisis like the coronavirus one? Information first. Across all the 6 countries we surveyed, large majorities say that they find that news media have helped them understand the pandemic and helped explain what they can do in response to the pandemic. A large minority do not use news media, do not trust news media, and do not think news media helps them, but most do. Misinformation next. This is complicated stuff, and I want to stress that surveys do not always give a robust view of whether people are in fact exposed to misinformation. But as I said at the outset, misinformation is a social fact too, and I think it's important in itself to understand how people understand it. We try to do that in our survey research by asking people about both sources they might see false and misleading information from and the platforms that they might see false and misleading information on. If we look at the sources that people say they see a lot or a great deal of misinformation from, concern varies from country to country, but generally it focuses on 3 types of sources. People are concerned about ordinary people that they don't know, often sharing things online. People are very concerned about politicians, and in some countries, quite a large minority are concerned about news media as a potential source of false or misleading information. If we look at platforms next, the center point of concern really is social media. It's worth noting, though, that in every case, both across the sources and the platforms, it's a minority who say that they see a lot or a great deal of false or misleading information. This is just a snapshot, and as with trust, in a high-stakes and tumultuous situation, things can change quickly. In the UK, where we have followed the crisis closely, just as trust in government has declined sharply, the number of people who say that they're concerned about false and misleading information about coronavirus from the UK government itself and from politicians has grown dramatically. So, in summary, what we find across these three areas of our research is that people rely on news media, but also politicians and platforms, for news and information about the coronavirus. They often don't trust the sources and platforms they rely on, and there are widespread concerns over potentially false and misleading information, especially from strangers, and arguably most importantly from politicians and via social media. But overall, the only source or platform of information we find consistently associated with how much people know about the coronavirus as a disease is news, which demonstrably help people in most of the countries we research be more informed about the disease. So, where does that leave us? I think there are different takeaways for different actors here, as well as a broader takeaway that no one can lift all of this on their own. And I think we need to collaborate, even as we should often also compete with and criticize one another. For researchers like myself and many of the academics joining Global Fact 7, I hope we will see more genuinely international work on how these issues are playing out in different parts of the world. The surveys we have done cover just 6 countries and 10% of the world's population. So there's obviously much more work, and we can't assume that these findings hold up everywhere. In addition, of course, I hope there'll be more attention to sources and platforms of misinformation, as well as this point about outcomes. Are people, in fact, misinformed? To supplement the ongoing work on the basic fact that, well, there is a lot of misinformation out there. For journalists, I think our findings are in part encouraging. People turn to journalists in a crisis. They trust news media more than many other institutions, at least in this situation, and they demonstrably benefit from journalists' work. But the findings, I think, are also challenging. Even in an unprecedented crisis, and even in an age of abundant supply and ease of access, between a quarter and half of our respondents say they haven't relied on news for information about coronavirus in the last week. It's clear we're not reaching the whole public, and we're not serving all communities well. For platforms, I think our findings provide yet another reminder that despite the steady stream of announcements and initiatives, there is much more to be done. And perhaps also reason to note that people are often skeptical of the governments that platforms increasingly collaborate with. These for-profit and often very closed environments remain, to different degrees, very opaque. They're very inconsistent often in enforcing their own standards, and is unnecessarily and dangerously hard for independent third parties to understand what is going on and to respond to the problems where they are identified. I don't see how this can go on indefinitely. For politicians, our research suggests that the whole political class, and sometimes even our governments themselves, are seen as central to misinformation problems by much of the public. Prominent politicians often set the news agenda, they take collectively binding decisions, and they influence their most loyal supporters' attitudes and behavior. With this power comes responsibility, and it's clear that some politicians are more interested in the power part than the responsibility part of it. And perhaps worth noting that beyond the coronavirus, much of what is arguably the most consequential misinformation in my adult lifetime has come from elected officials, whether during the run-up to the Iraq War or around climate change, just as we're reminded every day in the United States right now that public authorities like the police also sometimes lie and mislead. For the public, our research suggests that while some pundits seem to think that most people are naive idiots who are easily fooled and misled, we find little support for these condescending assumptions. We are all naive some of the time, and we are all occasionally idiots. But I can find no convincing evidence that most people are naive idiots most of the time. In fact, most people come across in our research as pretty discerning, rather skeptical, and relatively well informed, even as they are also very different, disagree vigorously, and many hold political views, or support politicians that others might find abhorrent. I think we should not confuse the latter part of this, the irreducible complexity and deep conflicts that characterize free societies, with the problems of epistemology and information. If we try to solve for disagreement, even incredibly disturbing, offensive, and shocking forms of disagreement that concern the very questions of who we are and how we live together, we're working against the crooked timber of humanity and the fundamental reality of value pluralism and conflict as part and parcel of politics. If people are, as our research suggests, in fact relatively informed, despite all the very real problems that we face, perhaps we should see that as a kind of success. And then remember that no member of the public gets there on his or her own. They get there in part by taking a risk and relying on independent professional journalists, fact checkers, and perhaps occasionally researchers. And we have to show them every day that they are right to trust us, as I know all of you strive to do. Thank you very much.
Rasmus, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, especially about the role that journalism can play and already is playing in giving people information about the virus. So now we'll go around and allow the other panelists to introduce themselves and give their initial thoughts about what are the most important things that research can tell us or is telling us about the spread of misinformation around COVID-19, and about what perspectives they think are most useful in understanding the infodemic, either globally or in different regions of the world. Why don't we start with you, Theresa? Take it away. Thanks.
Yeah, hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Theresa Amobi. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Lagos, Department of Mass Communication. I'll start by saying that what I have learned from the information space, from the lessons I have learned, information space has become chaotic. Truth is becoming swamped by falsity. I would like to let you into a few COVID-19 conspiracy theories and misinformation that have been circulating in the public domain in Nigeria. You know, we have a lot of claims about steam inhalation preventing coronavirus, using garlic, onions, lemon, piper Guinness, Negro pepper, Siam weed to cure the coronavirus, boiled pineapple, and so on and so forth, with lime and ginger as a cure for coronavirus. And we have also been told that coronavirus is usually inactive in tropical countries. So which means that there are some people who do not believe that there is anything like coronavirus in Nigeria. Another one is that African blood has immunity against coronavirus. And then when you eat a lot of pepper, that can also cure the coronavirus. I have a video. I don't know if we can play the video.
Good day. My own name is Prophetess Dupe Oluwaniyi. I brought the cure of the coronavirus, yes, since the beginning of this pandemic, since the beginning of this problem. I have been begging God, praying unto God to please release us the remedy, the solution over this coronavirus, because you have power on everything that you have created. And when He answered my prayer, I am very amazed. Look at this weed very well. Many are calling it Siam weed, mint leaf, and the botanical name for it is a Chromolina odorata. We call it
So videos like this are making the rounds. And then we have conspiracy theory.
It looks like we lost Theresa there, hopefully just temporarily. We'll try to bring her back. I think her presentation was already starting to underscore a kind of cognitive dissonance that comes up when we talk about the infodemic, which is that on the one hand, we have somewhat reassuring information about what most people know and where they get their news. But on the other hand, we see a very terrifying picture when we look at the actual rumors that are circulating, and in some cases have very, very dangerous consequences for health behavior. We'll go ahead and bring up Elizabeth Saad from USP in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and hopefully we'll have a chance to bring in Theresa again later in the conversation. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon for the part of the audience. I'd like to thank this invitation and the participation on this important panel. Well, first of all, I'd like to tell you that it's important to give you a small view of our environment, because polarization is the leading mood of our daily life here. And now we are facing a slight positive move from the audience to news media, especially to legacy and traditional one, as they are taking now a central role as a reference of clear and reliable information. This occurs much because we are facing a huge threats from government information about COVID and another bunch of problems, consequent related to politics. No? The volume of bad information, confused information is huge, especially on social platforms. I'm not giving you a specific research at this first intervention, but give you the idea on how Brazilian academic research is working on the problem of fact-checking and the COVID crisis. No, our research is more focused now to quantitative researches about fake news, and less focused on epistemological and ontological fact-checking as a process that should be included in the education curricula of journalists and communicators. Here, academy has a modest participation on the daily professional fact-checking arena, which is mastered now by different partnerships and associations among fact-checking agencies, social platforms, monitoring providers, and autonomous procedures of legacy breadth. The point here is that most of these initiatives had adopted different methodologies and procedures to identify and debunk fake news. And this is the aspect that I indicate that academic research could be involved and could be a game changer about fact-checking. The development of a common method and the introduction of this as a discipline in the journalism education curricula. I have pointed here some positive or sensitive points for our academic activity, and I'll show you some of them. First, we need a new urgent reframing of the basics of journalism ontology in order to include fact-checking and debunking as a new journalistic process that has method and common procedures. I've watched yesterday a presentation here, and IFCN has this structure and method, but we must put this in our Brazilian education of journalism. A second question, it's important to have a more effective attitude towards sources, especially the scientific ones, in order to avoid tendency and shallow reporting that could misinform audience. And also, academy could collaborate with a huge training effort to journalists to deal with data and all tools related to data, and to know how to work with data scientists, for example, and how a data scientist could collaborate in a newsroom. Well, these are the more evident questions that our academy could collaborate, but it's important also to understand that our role in society now is quite complicated because the government, also our government, make many efforts to blur or to misinform about our activity, our researches, especially now in this crisis, and all the time in social networks, especially in WhatsApp, we are facing a complicated fight against the good word about this crisis and COVID. Basically, is this that I want to talk in this first intervention. I'd like to thank you from here, me. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. I think you really underscore a point that Rasmus also hinted at, which is how much work there is left to do, how much improvement journalism can make in terms of responding more effectively to a crisis like this one, in terms of covering politicians as well as health misinformation. And now we'll hear from our the last of our four panelists, Thorsten Quandt from the University of Münster. Thorsten, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Thorsten Quandt from the University in Münster in Germany. And I thank you very much for having me here today in this amazing panel. Rasmus in the keynote and the other panelists already presented some fascinating facts and insights on the infodemic. And I hope I can add another facet with some data from a large-scale content analysis we did in the case of Germany. So sorry about that. I'm a data guy. As a scientist, I need to bring data with me. And in that study, we had a look at the journalistic mainstream news media, but also at alternative news media, which are thinking of themselves as being independent from the traditional media houses. And we looked at the news content they published during the pandemic via Facebook. First of all, why Facebook? It's a very relevant amplification system. In Germany, it's still the main message-based social media platform. However, more importantly, most media post their main news in Germany in short form there. So it was a great way to get an overview of what is happening in the country. That means that we didn't observe just a handful of media, but a big chunk of the overall German news output. That means close to 80 mainstream news media and slightly more than 30 alternative media. For a comparison, we also had a look at the fact checkers as a gold standard to identify conspiracy theories and fake news. The analysis is still ongoing, so I will concentrate on the first 3 months of the pandemic here from January to March, which means more than 100,000 messages. Naturally, we did that with computers, not by hand. And you already can see the slide, I think. So what did we find here? First thing, what you can see here is an overview of the news flow in these 3 months from left to right. And you can see a few details here that might be interesting. First of all, you may notice a few dents in that graph. That's the weekends. There is a drop of news output. But what you can see and what's more interesting is that the overall news output was relatively stable. You see some growth towards the end, but it's not an explosion. It's not that it tripled or something like that. And what you can also see is that Corona didn't play a big role for quite some time, and it just started when in Germany it actually became an uncontrolled epidemic. We also analyzed the topics in the messages, which is probably a bit more interesting than just the flow, using an inductive method. So the computer extracted that from the material. And if you could have a look at the second slide, could you please? Thank you. There you can see the actual topics that are in there. So the topics are these colors that move from left to right. You don't have to look at all the detail that is given there, just at the overall flow. And what you can see is that the topical composition changes over time, so the colors actually change. In the beginning, as I said, there was not much. Then we found a lot of reporting on numbers. So there was this type of horse race reporting very quickly, had comparative numbers from several countries and were commenting on who's doing better or worse. And when it actually hit the country, then you could see this sudden growth, and then it gets much more diversified and plural here. And it was covering the more tangible effects on the lives of the people. So like the National Soccer League pausing the season or school closing and things like that. So it was very diverse and not just supportive of the government or something like that. Now let's go to our third slide, the comparative data from alternative news media. And here it's getting really interesting. Same data, same methods, done by computers. So there's no prejudice from our side, basically, because the computer found that. So what we see is the overall shape of that curve is very similar. Alternative news media reacted to the same events, as you can see by the shape. So they do not exist in a bubble detached from the rest of society. However, the composition of the messages differs a lot from the traditional mainstream media. You don't even have to look at the figure itself, just at the categories below that. I hope you can read it. But what you see there is a lot of coverage on failures, problems, and threats to society. So in essence, what we find here is a pretty consistent anti-systemic narrative, which is very different from what we see in traditional news. So basically the same events, but very different interpretations, with that recurring suspicion that the power elite in the country is either profiting or incompetent. Finally, we also had a look at the conspiracy theories and fake news. The good news is actually that we didn't find a lot of fabricated news, and that refers to what also Rasmus said in his first presentation. But we found quite a few conspiracy theories that alternative news media pushed, like Corona was built as a bioweapon, Bill Gates might be behind this to push the vaccination, or the government knew about the virus for years and is involved in a sinister conspiracy against the people. So interesting enough, the traditional news media covered these conspiracy theories as well, but in virtually all cases by correctly labeling them as what they are and in the context of stories about conspiracy theories. So I promised to keep this short. So what's the take-home message here? Well, I think with this computational analysis, we could analyze this overall flow of the news and found clear evidence of a difference in the two systems between traditional and alternative news media. And the alternative news media were basically using Corona to further push their anti-systemic, often populist narrative. And for them, Corona was just a sign of the failures of the political or societal system. So I don't think they're an alternative to traditional media, but more like a dark mirror of them. So that's my research in a nutshell. I hope you find it interesting. And if you want to have more detail, you will find it online. The study was out called Pandemic Populism, and there's another one, Pandemic News. I think you can Google it or just send me an email and I can send you more detail. Thank you.
Thorsten, thank you so much. That's really interesting. And I think it sort of brings us immediately to a much bigger and perhaps really difficult question. We've heard a lot about how journalists in different parts of the world and working for different kinds of media have responded to this crisis and what sort of information they've been providing. So let me ask a perhaps unfair question. What role do the different media systems that exist, say in Brazil or in Germany or in the United States or in Nigeria, play in explaining the very different responses that we've seen? If we want to understand the sort of world-leading response to policy response to this crisis in Germany, and the much more incoherent responses in Brazil or the United States. What role, does the media system help to explain that? How do we understand what's gone wrong in places like Brazil and the US? And I'd love to hear from all of you. Yeah.
So Theresa, do you want to go first? Or Beth?
Okay. We are facing now. Can I answer this?
Yes, please go ahead. And we're hearing you very well.
Okay. We are facing now here in Brazil a slightly change of the image of the traditional media. No, the most the biggest newscast here in Brazil, Jornal Nacional, is now having a huge increase of audience. Which is very interesting because people has a political tendency to think that Jornal Nacional is something linked to the government and it's a media monopoly and so on. And now this Jornal Nacional, this newscast, has assumed an interesting role on public opinion, and also the print media, the print journals. We are facing an interesting position of print media to offer contents more related to analysis, a deeper content, not only the facts or so. So it's very interesting, this change of the mood of the audience to this traditional outlets. But we have, at the same time, a huge problem with dissemination of misinformation and disinformation via WhatsApp. And especially WhatsApp has a huge influence in the oldest people to disseminate this. So it's a fight because we don't have the control on what is going on WhatsApp groups. If you don't participate inside the group, you don't have this control. And so it's an additional problem to researchers to find a way to understand the audience behavior and the audience mood in this platform. That is.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Thorsten, do you want to weigh in as well?
Yeah, sure. So I think there is no one answer to your question in a way, because also this the news system, but also the system of alternative news media, if you call it the system, is diverse. It's not a uniform block. So what we have in the country, for example, are some, at least in the case of Germany, some alternative news media that are right-leaning, very conservative or extreme right. We have some conspiracy theorists in there, but we also have some media that are more or less influenced by some other countries. For example, the case of Russia Today, which is very open about what they do. So it's not one size fits it all in a way. So the overview that I was showing you is basically very roughly combining all of these together, which is very critical and problematic in many ways. So it's really an overview. Same is true for the normal news media or the traditional news media, what they call the mainstream. So again, you have the national media, you have regional ones. But what we can see in our country is that when you look also at survey studies, I mean, Rasmus was already commenting on that, where there's another study done by colleagues from my university, Lena Frischlich and colleagues. They also looked at whether people actually perceive that, and we can see the overwhelming majority doesn't perceive fake news, and some of the people actually got conspiracy theories. But there is a group that actually listens to these media and can be influenced by them. It's probably a smaller one. It's not like this big, huge echo chamber that's out there. But we see several groups in the country that are kind of getting away from the center, the core of society, and develop this anti-systemic narrative, which is an issue because they basically do not accept the basis of our democracy anymore, and that is certainly an issue. So I think. In the theories that we have on what is happening out there, I think it's not this filter bubble or this echo chamber, but the polarization and some splinter groups are certainly a relevant thing and something we really have to look at, because they also played a big role, I think, in spreading false information in the corona crisis. And even if it doesn't impact the whole of the society, each individual case where somebody gets a fake news item and thinks, I need to drink a specific fluid and then corona cannot do anything to me, and that person dies from that, that one single case is bad enough, right? So it mustn't be just the collapse of society, but there are other effects of this that are also pretty dangerous, I think.
Thanks, Thorsten. Just a quick follow-up. I mean, is it too much to say that the relatively high levels of trust in establishment media in Germany and trust across parties acts to tamp down the influence of some of those more extreme sources and voices that you mentioned? Do you think we know that?
Yeah, in a way, yes. So there were studies by colleagues from the University of Mainz. They did studies on trust in media, and what they found is interesting, because they found that trust is increasing, but it's also decreasing at the same time. So in some groups, it was growing, and there were other groups where it's going down. So news media have a lot of trust in the core of the society, but we have some peripheral groups that actually lose the trust and then actually cannot talk with the rest of the society in a way. So that is what we have in Germany as an issue that we are discussing. And you could also see that with time, these splinter groups got a bit more influential and got also media coverage, which is an issue by itself, because that might also be a false bias, because maybe they're not really that important, but they also showed up in the news media because they had these demonstrations, what they call the hygiene demonstrations, Hygienedemonstrationen and things like that. But in the end, it were probably just, maybe not a handful of people, but not hundreds of thousands of people, but they looked like it. And then media reacted to it, right?
Thanks very much. Rasmus, I know you'll have thoughts about this.
I'll only add very briefly to what Elizabeth and Thorsten has said. I think it's clear that media system differences make a big difference, and our colleagues have explained some of the reasons why. There is also just a very fundamental difference, which is that it's very few countries around the world who have a large and commercially relatively robust news media that can invest significant amount of resource in independent professional journalism and fact-checking. This is obvious to most people on the call, but I think many people in Western Europe and North America often forget that most people in most of human history in most of the world, and indeed today, have never had the luxury of having access to the kind of sort of highly professionalized, highly profitable journalism that a few of us have come to take for granted and now see being threatened. So there are very, very significant differences there. The other one I wanted to just sort of highlight, so it doesn't sort of slip from it, is I think Elizabeth's remarks are incredibly critical to this, just as Theresa's were, that if we don't recognize how profoundly political some of these problems are and how profoundly tied they are into people's identities, including how they think about religion and how they use religion as a guide to the world, and solely think of this as problems of information and knowledge, then we are fundamentally misunderstanding the problem. And if we misunderstand the problem, we will be incapable of addressing it effectively. We may even address it in ways that make it worse by further alienating people who are already often regard some forms of professional journalism with great skepticism and often feel that their values and their worldviews are at best not reflected and at worst actively denigrated by the ways in which journalism is practiced. And I just think we have to face that problem head on. We see it around the sort of progressive concerns that are very vocally raised rightly now in my view in the United States around issues of race and police violence in the media. But of course, there are other communities who have other concerns and feel misrepresented and not heard for other reasons. And I think there is a danger that we don't think enough about how we might be able to reach people we disagree with, and sometimes disagree very fundamentally with, and who are very different from us.
Thank you, Rasmus. That's an excellent point. We have a question from the audience from Angie Holan, the editor of PolitiFact, and that's whether we know anything about the role of sort of deliberate, organized misinformation or disinformation campaigns, especially state-sponsored campaigns, in spreading, misinformation related to coronavirus. Obviously, we've heard a lot about the role of these kinds of campaigns in elections in different parts of the world in the last several years. But is that a problem when it comes to so-called fake news around COVID-19?
Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Thorsten, please.
Okay, I could say a little bit about this for the case of Germany. So we know in Germany there's this suspicion that there was some influence by China and Russia. These are the usual suspects in a way, because in the past they were active on social media, and there were some fake accounts that could be more or less traced back to Russia. At least that was what was claimed. We know that from also Twitter research that they found some traces here. We did some research on that during the last German elections, and we didn't see much there. And I think when it comes to people that are active in the corona crisis, I think most of them operate from within the country. So what we see is an interesting overlap of right-wing groups that we have at the moment. I mean, really extreme right, and also conspiracy theorists, maybe because their thinking is kind of similar, fits each other, because they all both have this idea that there's this corrupt power elite, which is the state, and that is basically somehow behind all of this. So it kind of fits, and we see this kind of, I wouldn't say that they're united, but there's some kind of crossover extremism, I would call it, from these groups. But I'm sure that is different in other countries. As Rasmus rightly noted, this is an observation from a society that is kind of, if you compare it to other countries, balanced and very center-oriented, and also has a very strong media system. So I'm pretty sure that the experiences in other countries are different. Also, our election system is very different. So I think it's not the easiest target or the most valuable target if you want to do some kind of disinformation campaign to change the country from the outside, right?
Yeah. Does anybody else want to weigh in? I think it's fair to say that in the US at least, go ahead, please.
Maybe just quickly to add, first of all, I just want to give a shout out to, for example, Renee DeRista from Stanford, from the Internet Observatory, who I think does amazing work on this. And of course, she was one of the researchers recently involved in documenting a particular information operation emanating out of China in this area. So I think these problems are real. I think they're serious, and I think we have some very good researchers who are working on them. At the same time, I would supplement those observations by saying I think we need to be conscious of two things. One is that arguably the intent of these operations often is to increase polarization and undermine trust in institutions. And I think First Draft and others have been right to sometimes question whether we are at risk of becoming complicit with information operations if we amplify them beyond what the actual substantial scale and scope of their achievements would merit. And in that sense, there is a risk, I think, sometimes that sort of elite debate and news coverage even can become part, if you will, of the information operation, that it's not just the platforms that are being hacked, it's also the news media. And I think we just need to be very sort of conscious of that. And the other thing I would say, again, along the themes of what I said in my opening remarks, is that you can have a situation in which there is a problem that's very real and very serious without it necessarily having a large and measurable impact on public opinion, attitudes, or behavior. And if that's the situation we face with information operations, I think there is a sort of a further reason to just remember the sort of the both journalistic, I think, and scientific injunction that great claims require great evidence. And if we accept the narrative that, it was the Russians that did it, we are effectively discounting other alternatives, such as, for example, sometimes it's our own politicians who did it. And there is an opportunity cost, if you will, to getting things wrong. We misunderstand problems sometimes, and if we misunderstand them, as said, we can't counter them. And in this particular case, we run the risk of effectively aiding people who want to undermine us.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like it would be easy to pay too much attention to the story of state-backed misinformation in this case. We have another question from Senegal in this case about whether we know anything about the role of religious sources and perhaps religious themes, religious-related misinformation in the infodemic. Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, we have here kind of an influence of the non-Catholic, Christian but non-Catholic churches and religions here in Brazil, and their influence of the pastors is huge, and they, in the first hour of the crisis in last March, they said, no, this is not real. You can go and to our services and so on. Then they changed it a little bit, but the government, the federal government, especially the president and his group around him, are supporters and believers of this branch of religion. So they had an influence. And they work against information about health and everything around the COVID. And this is a problem also to media coverage, because you're going to question a very big group of people and audience, So we have some vehicles, TV, for example, that has as the proprietary is a very important pastor, and all the information of his media group is not an information that is positive to the people to work with this problem of COVID. So it's a huge influence here in Brazil.
Thank you. And we don't have audio from Theresa, but she's suggesting there's a similar story in Nigeria, for instance, where some religious leaders have advanced conspiracy theories. For instance, a pastor in Nigeria who has pushed the 5G conspiracy around COVID-19. We have a question from a sort of meta question from Chris at the IFCN, which is how good has the media coverage of the infodemic been? Right? What do you think of the way that journalists have addressed research about the influence of misinformation and disinformation? If you want to put on your pundit hats for a second, Thorsten, please.
Yeah, we have some data on that in our study. So what we could see in the study is that in contrast to a lot of criticism, the overall coverage was pretty plural and not just supporting the government. There was a lot of criticism in the country, also from some of my colleagues, saying that there was too much coverage of the elite, too much coverage of the political leaders and their decisions, and that the media were just, more or less supporting that one specific view of the society and what you could do in that situation. But that is not supported by our data. The data actually shows that, funny enough, that, for example, the alternative news media were focusing much more on a very small number of elite actors, which is easily explainable by their concentration on the ideological side of society. So for them, politicians are super important. Whereas a lot of the journalistic reporting was on things that had nothing to do with politics in a way. So as I said before, there was a lot of coverage on the everyday effects of COVID in the country. So, the soccer league, as I said before, that was a big topic for the Germans, obviously. And there was also this, a lot of reporting, on the local effects. So stories about children that actually brought food to the elderly and things like that. So you had all of that in a variety of media. And I think a lot of the criticism is just because people are focusing very much on these, the coverage of the political elite, and do not see what journalism also does, at least for Germany. I know it's different in other countries, but I think it's that very quick criticism, media are doing the wrong thing. They're doing this crisis reporting and just push facts out there and support the government. I think that's a bit too easy for me.
Thank you, Thorsten. Does anyone else want to come in on that point? Okay, we have a series of really excellent and incredibly difficult questions coming in from the audience. I'll bring up two, and then we can go around and let you tackle them. One is, what can we do? What can academia tell us about what we can do in countries where trust in media is rapidly declining? In other words, how can we get people to believe accurate information related to this virus that is, that is being provided to them in the mainstream media? So that's not an easy problem to solve. And the second, perhaps controversial question is whether it's true around the world or only in some countries, Germany, as Thorsten suggested, that misinformation tends to spread more on the political right and come from sources on the political right. Why don't we first address the question of audience trust and how to build it, especially in a health crisis like this, and then take on the political question. Please.
I think here in Brazil, it's important that academia stay more visible to the society, and to show how important its activities, researchers and scientists are doing for the society, and especially in this moment. In my University of São Paulo, there are a bunch of good researchers, scientific researchers that could collaborate to the information, to changing the mood of the audience, of the society. But academia is quite don't make itself visible, and news coverage by the media, they don't cover very much our activity, although they have the scientists as a connection, as a resource, but we must to be more visible and assertive for society. That is.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about what we can do to build trust in health-related information coming from establishment sources? Theresa, do we know anything about successful measures in Nigeria, for instance?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, at least in Nigeria, the media has more trust than government or social media or religious organizations. That is what studies have shown. Because the study I just conducted, even though it's not majority, but 44% of Nigerians trust the media, as against 26% that do not. But for government, that is something else, and for social media, is way back there. And so and the fact-checking organizations are also doing a lot. For instance, Africa Check, most of these, instances of conspiracy theories and misinformation that I outlined in my work have been debunked by Africa Check. And Africa Check is doing a good job. They are having sensitization podcasts and all that to try to tell people how to verify information before you believe it. And then we're having, conversations at micro levels, meso levels, and macro levels to try to tell people that a lot of those things are not true. But, the problem is that these things are filtered through cultural factors, like and prejudices, beliefs that people have around. There are people, for instance, certain areas of the country who attribute every disorder to supernatural factors. They believe that no death is natural. Even when you have car accidents, it must be something somewhere that caused the accident. So, there are still people like that in society who will always believe in miracle remedies, miracle cures, believing that there's nothing like coronavirus. Because, if you see the way some people behave when you tell them about social distancing, observing some of these social media, they will say, please, why are you telling us this? Please stop wasting our time. There's nothing like that. Government is just using it. And try as much as you will to convince them otherwise, they will not agree. So there are still going to be such people in society. But at least if we have a critical mass who will believe that some of these things are misinformation, then I think that the media, the problem is that the rate at which this misinformation is spawned, is faster than the verifications and fact checks can go on. And you find that some of these things also come from the most notable sources in society. People you will not expect to peddle, speculations. And so when people trust such people, for instance, religious leaders, and they say certain things, and I think some of them are driven by the fact that when, for instance, Nigeria had this lockdown policy, they wanted, most of them were no longer having their members in church. And people were saying that on television and, on the internet. And I think they were losing, funds. And so they wanted their members back. So they came up with all sorts of conspiracy theories to explain why government was telling people to stay at home. Some people see through that, others do not. But I think, in the final analysis, we are taking baby steps. And I believe that if we continue, that trajectory will get there.
Theresa, thank you very much. I think we probably have time for one more question, and it's one that I imagine everyone on the panel can speak to, at least briefly. And that is this question of whether we tend to see in this case, in the infodemic, that misinformation is more often tied to right-leaning media, or more often comes from politicians on the right. As some of you have mentioned, there's a close relationship between the spread of misinformation on social media and political rhetoric we hear in some countries. Can we say that definitively? It spreads more often on the right, and if so, do you have thoughts on why that might be? How do you try to think about that in your research? And Thorsten, why don't we start with you, since I think you suggested that in Germany, at least, that's very much the case.
Yes, I think in Germany the answer would be pretty easy, because it's yes. So it's certainly more on the right. I think there are several reasons for that. One of it is probably that the left has different forms of protest. So the strategies are different. They bring it more to the streets and more traditional forms of protest, whereas the right uses the internet in a very clever way to actually push their agenda, and especially push their narrative. This, as I said before, this narrative of the power elite being corrupt. And so I think for the case of Germany, you can definitely say for the time being, we see it's coming more from the right. That doesn't mean it has to be naturally like this. It could also come from other groups in society. That's just an observation based on the data, and it's not just our data. I think it's in all the data in Germany on this case that we see it's coming more from these groups. But again, we also see other new groups that traditionally weren't connected to the right, that more or less are joined, or that are going in the same direction. As I said before, this type of crossover extremism, where you have people that are coming more from, conservative in an environmental way, or people that come from the conspiracy side, and they kind of move in the same direction. That is something to worry about. But we see, how this develops over time. But that's just the case in our country. I'm pretty sure in other countries, it might be different.
Thanks very much. Elizabeth, do you find something similar in Brazil? I mean, obviously, your president has drawn a lot of attention for...
Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah. Here in Brazil, I can say that the right and the far right, not only the politicians, but followers and admirers, fans, and so on, they are very professional in using media platforms, in creating newspapers in commas that have the objective to disseminate the information that is coherent to their thoughts. So they use this as a professional one. They invest money, too much money on this. There are groups of businessmen who fund this activity. So media to cover this is a very complex activity. That is.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. And I think we have time for one more thought. I know, Rasmus, you had an opinion about this to share.
Well, I suppose I would like to dress it up as fact, but let's see how that comes across. I mean, I would say, first of all, I agree with what both Elizabeth and Thorsten has said, that in the countries where I've seen the most research, I think there is a tendency that a lot of the misinformation that's been identified is emanating from prominent politicians who are on the political right, and sometimes amplified by prominent media that are also on the right, whether through news or more commonly through various forms of pundits and commentators that they lend their brand to. That said, I would sort of add two things. One is that I think those on the left who think that misinformation is primarily a right-wing phenomena is just worth remembering that quite a lot of scientists, I think, would say that the left has been instrumental in driving anti-science narratives around, for example, gene-modified foods and nuclear power and other issues, vaccines originally, homeopathy and other forms of treatment that many scientists are very skeptical of. So I think we need to probably hold our horses a bit without indulging in false balance before we jump to conclusions here. And then finally, we really need to remember that while left and right are meaningful categories in many Western societies, they really aren't in many others. And it's not the defining cleavage in many places. In a country like Nicaragua, for example, the government would probably call itself left-wing. That doesn't stop them from lying about the disease and the crisis. So I think people can have many different motivations for spreading this information, knowingly or unknowingly, and it's sometimes aligned with left and right, but far from always or far from everywhere.
Rasmus, thank you very much. That's an excellent and fact-based point on which we can wrap up. I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for their thoughtful contributions. We apologize collectively for some of the technical difficulties that we had. That's inevitable in these kinds of global virtual gatherings. But please feel free to reach out to any of us with any further questions. This conversation obviously is only just beginning. Thanks very much, everyone. Have an excellent Global Fact.